Hello, I'm Richard Winfield from the Directors Academy, and today's webinar is entitled Reading the Runes, How to Prepare for a New Normal by Reading the Runes. So let us get straight on and straight in. So here we are from the Directors Academy and Reading the Runes. In business, there should be no surprises. Now, there will be lots of surprises, but let's go through and see how we can avoid them or mitigate for them. So how to prepare for a new normal by reading the runes. So I'm Richard Winfield. I'm the independent authority on director development. I'm an international trainer and facilitator, currently locked down, but capable of working virally. So I'm an expert in corporate governance and executive coaching, including teaching people executive coaching. And of course, I'm the founder of Directors Academy and the author of the New Directors Handbook. So that's me. People call me when they want to bring structure and clarity to their thinking, because I can help them identify core issues and make complex ideas simple, holding the space for you to create your own solutions. So let's get going. How to prepare for a new normal by reading the runes. All events can be explained in retrospect. So there is always an audit trail going backwards. The question is, how can we forecast or prepare for things before they happen? Harold Macmillan was asked what he feared most in life, and his solution was, events, dear boy, events. So let's talk about forecasting and mitigation. Natural events that turn up. There will be wild cards, but nonetheless, it's very unlikely there will be anything which is a complete surprise. So we know that there are tsunamis. As a result of some tsunamis in recent decades, there are now far more instruments around to help us to forecast them. The fact is, if they come, they can be serious. How can we prepare for them, and how can we mitigate against their effect? Similarly with earthquakes. In the last few years, we've had an increasing number of 10-year and 100-year floods. So we need to prepare for different sorts of flooding. We need to be able to mitigate for them or avoid them. And similarly, volcanoes, we've had volcanoes for millennia, and when they erupt, they can be serious. What can we do to ensure that if and when they do, we can mitigate for them in business? Similarly, financial events. There's been a major crisis from selling subprime mortgages, and it's very obvious afterwards that these could easily have been forecast. It's very obvious afterwards that the people who were selling them didn't know what they were doing, and the people who were on the boards of the companies selling them certainly didn't understand. So some people did and made a lot of money, but they were very few. There have been numerous financial scandals, and in my experience in the last few years, it seems to be a habit almost for companies to declare a £40 billion black hole. And we do know every so often there will be a recession. Political events. Now, the Berlin Wall is a most interesting event for me, because it radically changed the way the world works. It radically changed people's expectations and understanding of the world. But some people foresaw it, because in Shell, they were developing the early scenario planning processes, which enabled them to recognize that something like the Berlin Wall coming down was quite likely. And when it did happen, they were prepared for it. We've had a major vote in the UK, which will upset relationships and trade around the world. Again, it wasn't quite expected, but there was a lot of reasons to believe that it might happen, and plenty of notice. Mr. Trump, a shock. But again, he came because people voted for him. Therefore, we can work out that there was a build-up of pressure, and we should be able to have forecast for that and prepared for it. I admit a bit of a strain. And currently, protests in Hong Kong. Again, these have only come out of the blue, perhaps, but it's very clear that the pressures for them have been building up over many years. And in fact, the situation of one country, two systems, is not stable in the long term. There have been industrial disasters. Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island were nuclear disasters. Now, there's very little that most of us can do about that. A few people in government and in the nuclear companies obviously could have taken steps to avoid the problems. But what we can do as business people is to recognize that something like this might happen. And if it does, what can we do to mitigate the problems? Fukushima was a combination of nuclear problem and tsunami. And again, nothing that other people could have done about it, but we could perhaps have been sensitive to the fact if you build a nuclear power station on the edge of a country where there's a possibility of tsunamis, things might go wrong. But the main thing is when something like that, which seriously disrupts the way a country operates, what can we do to be aware and to develop strategies which are resilient? Bhopal, and more recently another case in India, where bad maintenance has led to serious dangers because of escaping gases. In terms of disruption of trade, a constant threat. Currently, the USA and China are having battles as to who does what and what the relationship might be, and the responses can change over a matter of 2 or 3 months. But in the long term, this is likely to change the way the world works, or is it? And as a result of that, there are increasing regional trade agreements undermining the global trading that we were working towards. And part of that, bilateral deals too. And particularly, for example, in the UK, where Brexit is changing the way we relate to Europe and enable us to change the way we relate to others. Bilateral deals that are taken could significantly change import and export into the UK and relationships with other countries. Disease. Now, these diseases are interesting because they came out of the blue, and when they arrived, we didn't know what they were. The world has got rather more effective at dealing with them when they arrive. The question is, how can we avoid them arriving or be prepared for them when they arrive or mitigate their effects? So AIDS, SARS, and Ebola, very similar, and COVID-19 the same, because they have arisen basically from diseases transferred from animals, and they can be, as we know, extremely disruptive. And then swine flu. I've put swine flu slightly differently because swine flu we damn well know about. Swine flu is something similar to the others, probably where diseases get into the animal herd. But the danger is because we are mass producing large, very large numbers of pigs in confined situations where they rub up with people and the flu can get out. So similar effects, but this is slightly different because we really can manage or could manage and avoid the causes. Now, let me tell you about the myth of 1945. 1945 clearly was a very disruptive time because it was the end of the Second World War. The question is, how significant was that as a disruption, or was it in fact a catalyst to do with things that were happening anyway? So what happened in 1945? Well, it is understood that it was the start of the welfare state, but actually that's not true. The beginnings of the welfare state were before the First World War, and they were evolving slowly over the decades. But after the Second World War, as a significant disruption, and it caused the government to sponsor the Beveridge Report, which led to the formation of the UK National Health Service. So the UK National Health Service has been a major change to the way the UK operates, and it is part of an acceleration in the health welfare state. So that's something where the disruption of the war did lead to long-term changes. Now let's look at the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. Similar, a very big disruption. But what happened? Well, there was the Dodd-Frank Act and certain banking controls put in. You may argue how successful those were or were not, but what actually happened to the way the world works? I would suggest not a lot. So we have to consider then, what are these disruptions that are capable of changing the way the world operates? And if there is a disruption, what are those changes which are threatened that actually turn out and become change, or do they just recede back into the old normal? So what's the effect likely to be of COVID-19? A lot of talk at present about potential for change. It could be very significant. The question for business people in particular is, where will it be significant, and what will be the consequences, and what should you do to prepare for those changes and, so to speak, to ride the wave when it comes? So will there be a new normal? I think it's pretty clear there will be a new normal. The question is, what will that new normal comprise? So I'd like to tell you a little bit about two things. Let me tell you firstly about black swan events. Everybody knows that a swan is white. If you see swans where I live, we have lots of swans on the local pool, and they're white, and it's pretty much, you talk about a white swan. But surprisingly, when Europeans went to Australia, they discovered that in fact some swans are black. So a white swan event is something which changes the understanding of the world. Something impossible suddenly becomes impossible. So what can be in the black swan events recently? So what's going on in 2020? First black swan. The impossible has become normal. The impossible has become the norm, particularly in terms of rate of change. In reorganization, particularly, for example, in reorganization of the way hospitals work, but also the way laboratories work, the impossible has become norm. 10, 20 years worth of work done in 10, 20 days or hours. Perceptions have been challenged and dumped. What was assumed couldn't happen does happen. Barriers have been broken down. Assets have been repurposed. We have had dramatic things where we have built huge hospitals in days in order to respond. And collaboration, tremendous collaboration between potentially competing companies, because the purpose, the mission, the need was so great. People were prepared to break down old barriers and do new things. What sort of collaboration will happen in the future? Will those barriers go back up, or will they have learned to work in a different way? So let's look at some examples of how organizations and countries have changed and responded. Berkshire Hathaway was a major investor in American Airlines stocks. They sold the lot instantly. When the change came, they saw the future, they responded, they cut their losses and dumped their stocks very fast. Some countries were prepared. Now, it's interesting, these countries, Vietnam and Taiwan are countries, but neither major. And Kerala is only a state in the southern part of India. They have responded very successfully and had relatively very few infections. And they did this because they had some experience of things like SARS and so on in the past. And they had taken the trouble to prepare processes and systems and invest in resources so that when this came, they were ready. And they immediately applied what they'd learned. Now, you could say how fortunate they were in this case because they'd been through it before. But in a time of the internet in particular, everybody has the opportunity to know everything that anybody else might know. So the fact that they had the experience is no excuse for any other country for failing to do exactly the same things. And in particular, in Europe, for example, we ran behind China in terms of timing. And in the UK in particular, we ran behind Europe in terms of timing. So Europe first and UK later had absolute opportunity to learn from the learnings and experience of others. The question is, what do they do about it? Some companies are agile. Now, I'd like to talk about these three because they're all three are small companies, and two of them, the back two, are friends of mine as well. And they are significant because they're very young. Après Food on the left, Make Friends with Food, started off this year, 2020, in January or February, I think, and immediately became successful with a very high profile and a very high reputation as a healthy food cafe. Suddenly, they were not allowed to trade. Their business stopped. But very quickly, they revamped themselves as a local supermarket, providing an outlet for the commercial suppliers that they had been using before, which could no longer sell to restaurants and hotels. Since then, they have developed takeaway and national delivery services. Eat on the right is a similar company. They had grown up over the last 2 or 3 years. And in particular, they focused on pop-up activities. They provided catering at events, weddings, commercial events, and so on. And in particular, right before the COVID closure, they were at the Cheltenham Gold horse racing. In order to do that sort of business, they had to invest in a vacuum packing system such that they could produce very quick cook food. When I spoke to the owner of that at the beginning of the crisis, he told me he got 40 bookings for weddings and events, and so he was in a good state. And I did suggest that they might not last long, and in a few days he had none. But what did he do? He was contacted by a local brewery, which had a number of local pubs, and he became the supplier using his vacuum pack system for their takeaway food systems. And in fact, since the lockdown, he has been expanding his business. So in both cases, very quick, agile repurposing of their facilities to a new market has been successful. The one in the middle, Brewdog, is a rather rude, rather cheeky brewery. And again, they suddenly had no outlet because the pubs were closed. So they repurposed, and quite a few other breweries have done the same. They've repurposed their distillery in order to make hygienic hand rubs to provide to the health service and such like. So again, using the resources they had, complete change in business. So those are little companies, and you can expect those to be agile. But some companies are big companies, and they similarly can be responsive. And this is a lovely example because Ocado is one of the leading companies in terms of automation and robotics. And those boxes you see on the left are entirely computer controlled. There's no staff around at all. And they are what do the picking for on local delivery of groceries. Whereas Tesco has no such system, and they do all their picking by having people working in the supermarkets, going around just like a shopper and doing pre-ordered packaging. However, you can't just buy another set of robots, and you can't work them at more than 100% capacity. Whereas, particularly when a lot of catering companies and so on are closing down, there is an infinite supply of people. So Tesco was able to expand its local deliveries by a factor of 2 or 3 very quickly, whereas Ocado was rather more stuck. So it's interesting that you can be a very successful company, but not necessarily so flexible. Sometimes the old ways might be better. Some cities can be responsive. And in particular, as people were discouraged from traveling by public transport and moving around in cars and so on, there's been quite a lot of activity in terms of widening the pavements and narrowing the roads to enable people to use their bicycles and so on. Now, this is very significant because there's been a lot of talk and investment in cycle routes and such like over recent years. And there has been quite a lot of pedestrianisation of shopping areas and so on over recent decades. But it's been a very slow process because, as they say, the car rules supreme. And suddenly, with a major pressure, there's been all this change in investment supported by the public. The question is, what will come next? as a response to the cut down in all this commuting and traveling by car and so on, has been a dramatic change in the quality of the environment. Now, for some years now, there's been a lot of talk because of the discovery that pollution in cities is not just smoke from coal, which has in many cases got rid of, but nitrous oxides and so on, which are invisible but poisonous. And this is a photograph from Delhi, and just showing these are real photographs, the change in the atmosphere as a result of cutting back. And people who've been complaining about how bad the air is in cities suddenly discover how good it could be. What will be the impact of that in the future? What will change? What must change? And I have a personal plug here, because for all the fuss about this pandemic and all the changes that are going on, there is still this major threat of global warming and major changes to the way business can be done because of the results of global warming, and big opportunities to do something about it. So the question is, have all the changes being pushed by the pandemic disruption, are they going to reinforce and speed up and accelerate changes required to prevent global warming, or are they diverting people's attention? So this is a personal setup collection now. I put it together some time ago. I just got my flip chart, which I love, and just wrote down lots of thoughts. So there's no particular order, bit of order. And the question about these things is, these are all trends, things that were going on before the pandemic arrived. And the question for you is to decide which of these trends will be accelerated and become a real change as a result of the disruption, and which ones, like during the financial crisis in the past, will just go back to the old norm and be forgotten. So why do things change? One way they change is because of the black swan events, where suddenly the understanding and perception of the world changes. The reality of the world changes, but more significantly, the perception of the world changes. Black swan events. The world has changed. The facts have changed. Perceptions have changed. And expectations have changed. Black swan. But there's also the tipping point. And in a way, the tipping point is more what I'm interested in looking at my runes. Michael Gladwell wrote a book called The Tipping Point and has brought it to our attention. And he talks about the tipping point as being the moment of critical mass, the threshold, the boiling point. So what I'm asking you to think about is which of the things that I'm going to talk about now are reaching the tipping point, or have even been tipped over the tipping point as a result of the pandemic. Because if they still haven't reached that tipping point, then the probability is they will go back to the old world as we knew it. So first one, talking about cashless payments. There was concern about the use of cashless payments before the pandemic. Now there is a major concern about those people who don't have credit cards because they can't use cash. There's been a fantastic acceleration in the use of cashless payments, and the likelihood is almost certainly we shall not return. Similarly with home delivery. People have been stuck at home. They have been worried about going to supermarkets. They might not have been able to get to supermarkets, and they have taken on home delivery at a rate that previously people were maybe putting their toe in the water. They've had to try it. And the likelihood is, but not the necessity, that most people will stick with it. The question for people in retail in particular is, to what extent will all of them stick with it, more of them take it on, or will they go back to going normal shopping? The gig economy has been a major discussion in social terms in the last 2 or 3 years only. Gig economy are the people who work on 0 contracts, 0 hours contract. Generally, they are badly paid and insecure. And there's been a lot of discussion about the very fact that they are insecure and that they lack things like pensions and sickness benefits. They have become suddenly very important because these are the people providing the link, delivering all the things that we are buying from supermarkets, from Amazon and so on. Will that raising in their status lead to improvements in their employment facilities? Similarly, low-paid service workers, care workers, hospital workers, delivery drivers are some of the lowest paid, basic paid people. And suddenly society has appreciated that they are actually really, really important. And the term for them now is not low paid service workers, but key workers, high status. Let's just think about university education. University education has been expanded significantly over the last few decades, but is getting exceedingly expensive. And there is some consideration about whether the approach to student loans is in terms of long-term viability. I understand that something like 80% of student loans won't be completely repaid in 30 years. So is there any point in them? That's something maybe to review. Is that going to change? Because in particular, if students are not going to be able to go physically for full-time courses at universities and colleges, are they still wanting to do it? So distance learning has increased dramatically. Will that continue? Housing costs. Right across the planet, housing has been going, shall we say, through the roof. The cost of housing is now a major disruption and restraint on all sorts of other activities, and a great cost in terms of social support. What's going to be the implication, if any, of the pandemic? I have been dealing with transportation and town planning since the 1960s, and all that time we've talked about the problem of land value capture. This means basically, if you build a bus station, or if you build a railway station in particular, it will put up the value of the land, and the value of the land normally goes to the landowners, whereas the costs of the railway station, etc., go to the public or whoever. How do we capture that? Now, there has also been talk over the recent years about green construction and also insulation, etc., of housing. Is that going to be accelerated by this or set back? Working from home has suddenly become a major practice. And lots of people say, well, that's the end of working in offices, going to all sorts of things. The questions are, do people at home actually have the facilities for working from home? I work from home, but I have, and always have had, a dedicated office. It's easy for me. For many people, working on kitchen table, dining table with children and dogs around, maybe it's not quite as simple as it seems. So what's the future for working from home? Homelessness in the UK in particular has been a serious, major concern for many years or decades. And however people worked, it seemed to be one of those things which couldn't be solved. The government made a decision because homeless people were potentially spreaders of the virus, and homelessness in the UK more or less disappeared in a week. What's going to be the impact in the long term? If it can be done in emergency, what can be done in the long term? Or we just chuck these people out and return to the problem. Pollution in urban areas. I've already shown you the photograph of Delhi before and after. What's going to be the impact? To what extent is the pressure of changed public perception going to outturn in terms of changing urban strategy, in terms of urban structure and urban behavior? So urban structure. And then rail electrification is a major expense and is very seriously needed in terms of reducing carbon dioxide. It has been a slow investment, certainly in the UK. Is that likely to change as a result of this? Maybe, maybe not. And then let's talk about food. There's been a lot of talk over the years about air miles. Why should you buy food from the other side of the world, and in particular, bring it here by air and polluting the atmosphere in the meantime? Now, there is a recognition that not only should we be concerned about air miles, but also about the supply chain. And is that supply chain sufficiently rigorous and safe in terms of changes? So we talked about food miles. Again, There has been talk about the fact that agricultural workers are badly paid, and certainly in the UK, agricultural workers doing low-paid work are normally foreign workers who have been imported for their purpose. Suddenly, we realize how valuable and important these people are, and also that if travel is restricted, maybe we can't get hold of them. So a review of agricultural work and maybe an acceleration in the development of robots. Who knows? These are things to think about. We've talked about the resilience of the food supply chain. And let's just look at another aspect of food, which has been changing recently. Will it change faster? Was it going to change anyway? How relevant is the pandemic? So urban farms. That's one way of getting rid of air miles, is actually grow the food, and particularly in terms of salad stuffs and potentially vegetables, they can be grown not only in the city, but maybe underground in the city, or on the sides, or on the top of skyscrapers and so on. There's plenty of it around, but it's all really sort of experimental. Will that change? Will it be accelerated? A version of that is hydroponics, aquaponics, growing your products purely and simply in water with chemicals, which reduces the use of water and all sorts of other benefits. And finally here, plant-based meat. Combined with the next one about vegetarianism. Vegetarianism has been growing dramatically. Veganism has been changed dramatically. And it is increasingly recognized that in particular the production of beef, but also pork, having major impacts on the environment, and in particular being drivers to the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. Just go back to plant-based meat. It is reaching the time and point where it's becoming commercially possible. It's moving out of the laboratory into companies. Is that going to be expanded? And if so, will it be expanded more or less as a result of the pandemic? Floods. I've mentioned earlier, I think there have been an increasing number recently of 100-year and 10-year floods. Clearly, our expectations of flooding need to be revised, and we need to be more conscious of the damage they can do. So we need, as business people, to be able to mitigate, but also as countries maybe to prevent. An amazing thing to me, more than 10 years ago, I did a scenario planning exercise, quite a long-term exercise with the water authorities in the UK, and they were consistently complaining that there were proposals to build housing in floodplains, and when they objected, the government inspectors overruled them. And now, in the last 2 years, we've been seeing the results of that as new housing gets flooded out. So what are we going to do about housing in floodplains? One approach is natural flood management. Instead of canalizing and increasing the flow along rivers, is actually slow the flow down, put bends back into the route of the river, lots of trees, and maybe even badgers. Is that going to be accelerated? And if so, what will be the impact of that? And fires. Major fires are becoming normal in the news these days, not only in California and major fires in Australia, but also in the tundra around the Arctic Circle. What are we going to do to mitigate against this? And is that impact of these fires going to focus people more on the need to prevent the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Some problems are very significant in terms of finance, accounting, and tax collection, and are not really solvable by individual countries. So we need to consider what changes are needed and how to go about them in terms of global finance and accounting. And one of the major things that concerns me is if you look at companies going bust, and this comes back to resilience, many of them are a result of being over-leveraged because they've taken on debt in order to expand. And part of the reason for that is tax relief on interest charges. Should that continue? Should there be a financial transaction tax? And also another technical thing, which all these things adding up to the less than perfect operation of investment in companies. Should these things be reviewed? And if so, how do we go about it? And will the pandemic cause countries to work together better? And in particular, is how do you collect tax in the right place so that the tax can be used to develop and invest in the countries where the business is done? And the reaction against Amazon, Facebook, and Google is becoming increasingly pressurized. And these three companies have benefited greatly from the lockdowns. So maybe there will be even more pressure on countries to sort out taxation. What should be looking for there? And if there are changes in taxation for these three companies, how will that affect all other companies? And the millennials and the next generations. This has been something talked about for the last 5 or 10 years. Millennials are different sorts of people. They have different expectations. And in particular, they are the ones who are recognizing, even school children are recognizing, that the world that we have created so far is not going to serve them very well. And as these come into business, become employees, and as they start to vote, what impact will they have? And to what extent will the things that have gone on because of the pandemic and the lockdowns, will that influence and accelerate their ideas? So finally, I just thought I'd introduce you, I'm only going to introduce them, no more than that, some tools which I think you could use in order to consider some of these situations. First one, which I am very keen on, and this is our particular model, is scenario planning. I believe it's really important for every organization to undertake scenario planning before you do your strategy planning. And in a change, in a world which is so disruptive as we are in at present, scenario planning is a really, really important activity for you to take on. So that's my highest recommendation, that if you don't understand scenario planning, you learn about it. And if you'd like to learn about it from us, our system is developed from a system developed in South Africa. It's extremely simple, straightforward, and it's a very powerful tool. Next, Porter's 5 forces, the expectations and assumptions that you may have had about the way the market works could be disrupted. So you really ought to start doing an evaluation of the bargaining power of your customers, bargaining power of your suppliers, the threat of new entrants, threat of substitute products, and also the competitive rivalry within the industry, because things are changing. And the blue ocean strategy, another favorite of mine, but this is a means of looking at how you may and how your competitors might entirely disrupt the way a business is done. So look at which of the factors of the industry that you take for granted should be eliminated. Now, this take for granted is key, is it not, at this time of reading the rules? With tipping points and white swans or black swans, you cannot take anything for granted until you have checked that it's still valid. Which factors could be raised above the industry standard, and which factors could be reduced below the industry standard, and particularly if you do it significantly, and which factors should be created that the industry has never offered before. So it's a chance to really think through from first principles how you run your business and whether you're running the right business. And of course, SWOT, strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And the other form of it is what to do about SWOT, which is known as TOWS, where you look at a combination of opportunities and strengths, opportunities and weaknesses, and so on, and you develop the necessary strategies. So there you are. Thank you very much. I hope that's been thought-provoking. That's all it's meant to be. And that you will recognize you will register yourself with the Directors Academy if you've not already done so. So thank you for listening and watching, and I look forward to presenting my next webinar for you in the near future. Yes.